Hi girls, so for today's video, we are discussing the role of cortisol and how it impacts our hormone health. So I have been hyper fixated on sharing information over on Instagram, and likewise I've been sharing a few YouTube shorts here as well, all about our cortisol health and how it truly can impact our overall hormone regulation. And the reason for this hyperfixation is because in the month of February inside Living Well, my membership area, we are indeed working to care for our cortisol and therefore nourish our nervous system. So for today's video, I'm so excited to talk with you all about cortisol and how it can really hinder our healing process, because 55% of Americans report being stressed on a near daily basis. And I am somebody who believes that those numbers are probably even a little bit higher than that. If we were to ask people like how they actually categorize stress, I think oftentimes we kind of sweep things under the rug and we think this is just day-to-day living. This is just how I'm meant to be. This is how I'm meant to feel. When in actuality, if we kind of broke down what stress is and how it feels inside of our body, I have a feeling those numbers would be much higher. And in the same report, 50% of Americans also said that they feel fatigued. And so if you're somebody who you sleep all night, you get, 6 to 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and you wake up and you're still exhausted. And then throughout the day, you feel as though you're in a fog, especially come 2-3 p.m., where you get a little bit of that energy crash. Well, having that anxiety and having that fatigue are two tall tale signs of cortisol imbalance. And while cortisol is absolutely necessary for our body, when we wake up in the morning, I always say it's so important to get outside, look up into the sky indirectly at the sun, and to absorb that vitamin D into our eyes and to help elevate our cortisol levels earlier in the day. When this becomes a problem is that when we are spiking highs and lows all day long with these cortisol levels, because then it does impact our overall endocrine system. So what is cortisol? So cortisol is a hormone that is released by the adrenal glands and regulated by our HPA axis. And this hormone is really important in our body. We absolutely need cortisol, but as I had just mentioned earlier, we need it in healthy doses and at the appropriate time. The need for cortisol to be elevated earlier in the day and thus not at night is because cortisol is responsible for the circadian rhythm and our sleep and wake cycle. That's why you will oftentimes hear me on my channel, or if you follow me over on Instagram, you'll hear me talk about those feelings of tired but wired at the end of the day. And that is most likely due to a cortisol imbalance. So aside from its role in our circadian rhythm, cortisol is really important for our immune function. Having optimal levels of cortisol and not overactive cortisol is really important to have a really strong immune system for proper respiratory health. It's critically important for our reproductive health, which is why I think that it's something that I'm hyper focused on, because oftentimes when we are so stressed out, we can begin to have these irregular cycles. And I tell people, and so many of my clients and those of you that are in the membership area, I say this over and over again, but when we can bring in some of the practices that we're going to discuss today, we can bring a little bit more synergy back to our cycle and not be dealing with those monthly irregularities. Of course, high levels of cortisol can also cause GI upset as well as musculoskeletal dysfunction, because it can be really challenging and hard on our nervous system. So what are some of the areas that can be negatively impacted by our cortisol? I know I mentioned just a few, but of course our overall stress response. I say that I often can catch myself in these really sticky moments when all of a sudden I notice that I have a larger than life reaction to a situation that maybe didn't quite call for that level of a reaction. And I know instantly in that moment, it's because I'm feeling a little bit burnt out or a little bit fried, and that my cortisol levels are most definitely impacted. So our stress response has a huge role in all of this. And as I was saying earlier in the video, inside the Living Well membership area this month, we're focusing on cortisol care to nourish our nervous system. And that is because cortisol plays a major role in our overall health of our nervous system. So there are two facets of our nervous system. There's the parasympathetic parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. So when we're in a sympathetic state, that's that fight or flight state. And I find, as somebody who works with a ton of women, and a lot of women who have a ton on their plates. They have multiple children, they have a full-time job, they're keeping up with sports activities, they're trying to maintain a home, and they're trying to cook healthy, nourishing meals, which is everything that we focus on here in my space. But they've got a lot on their plate, and I can definitely feel all of these sentiments. So when we're in that fight or flight state, we're stuck in this adrenaline rush. And so when our adrenaline is pumping and our cortisol is pumping, it makes it really hard for us to move over to rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic state. And what can happen if we are stuck in that fight or flight state is that our body will begin to downregulate everything that it doesn't see as of importance because it thinks that we are truly under attack. So that can be our metabolic function, our immune function, our skin health, our hair health. All of these things become pushed aside and downregulated because they are not seen as the important threat. The important threat to our body is whatever it is that's causing us to be in this hyper responsive state. The problem is that most of the time, that hyper-responsive state that we're in that feels like an attack is omnipresent, or it's been there for a prolonged period of time, and it's not one thing that we can pinpoint to remove to help bring our metabolism back online, to help bolster and boost up our immune system. So this is where it can become really problematic. And as I was mentioning about those functions that are being slowed down, if not shut off by our body, metabolism is a really big one because cortisol can spike our glucose and spike our insulin levels. And what this can do is this can cause that blood sugar instability. And that can lead to cravings of foods that aren't supportive to help us feel calm and relaxed. This also can lead to a lot of snacking and infrequent meals, which doesn't help balance and stabilize our cortisol levels. And so being on this blood sugar roller coaster is a stressor in and of itself. So now we see that the stress response to our nervous system is activated. And now there's another stress response coming in from our actual metabolic health. So these two together make it really challenging for us to feel like we have sustained energy because we're kind of on this hamster wheel, always chasing that little extra bit of energy, that little extra bit of calm that we get from that next snack that we may be eating, or that next cortisol increase that gives us that little bit of a buzz. And so it can be really challenging to get off the hamster wheel, but don't worry, later in this video, I'm gonna give you all of my best tips and tricks. So how do we know then if potentially we're dealing with these increased levels of cortisol? Well, there's a few different factors that we can kind of go through this checklist. I'll put it here on the screen, and you can go through this checklist and see if you tick off more than 2 or 3 of the symptoms. But ways that we can check in with ourselves to recognize if potentially we're dealing with a cortisol imbalance is, 1, I always recommend this, to get still and to take time to be with our body without the world of distractions. And I know it's hard. The distractions are everywhere. But when we really can sit still with ourselves and focus on what's happening internally, we oftentimes can give ourselves some really incredible anecdotal feedback. So if you're somebody who, when I've been speaking all throughout this video, you're like, man, this sounds like me, then I would say, like, get still with yourself. Get out a journal, take a peek at some of the symptoms and write them down, because if that's the case, then we'll go into some testing and some of my next best tips. But some of the ways to know if you're dealing with increased cortisol are, of course, weight gain in, especially in around the face, impaired memory. This is a really big one. I know that if we're dealing with fatigue and mineral deficiencies and hormone dysfunction, memory also falls into those categories. But if you're somebody who frequently forgets why you're doing something or what you went to go do, that could absolutely be tied back to a cortisol imbalance. If you're somebody who's noticed accelerated aging or excess hair fallout, very dry, crepey skin, these all tend to be signs of cortisol imbalance, as well as if you're somebody who tends to suffer from muscle soreness, muscle weakness, and then of course, chronic fatigue. If you are chronically exhausted throughout the day, these two tend to be really indicative of dealing with that cortisol disrupt. So now as far as testing goes, there's a few different ways that we can go about testing our cortisol levels. I will link some of my favorites for you in the description box down below, but there's blood, there's urine, and there's saliva testing that you can get done to see if your cortisol levels are impacted. But if you're somebody who ticked off many of the boxes that I shared with you, or throughout this entire video, you're like, I'm pretty sure she's talking about me. There's so much that we can do to get started today, but I do of course recommend testing. I always say if we're not testing, we're guessing, but in the meantime, there's still a lot we can do to get the ball rolling. First and foremost, no one's gonna be surprised to hear me say this, and before you tune out and you think, yeah, please just listen, because this is where it all begins, and that's with sleep. And not just any sleep, but setting consistent bedtime and wake time is where the importance lies, because when you can go to bed in and around relatively the same time, day in and day out, we can begin to create that really beautiful circadian rhythm that we talked about earlier in the video. So acquiring a really healthy sleep routine, you all have heard me talk about this a million times here on my channel. And of course, supplementing at night. I'm not working with biooptimizers on today's video, but supplementing with a really great high quality magnesium and other sleep supplements are so critically important. But of course, sleep. Next to that is breathing exercises. Breathing exercises take you from that sympathetic to that parasympathetic state. So it actually detaches your breath to the thoughts in your mind. And when we can kind of create separation between, like, we're having an anxious thought and suddenly we start breathing rapidly, when we can separate our breath and our thoughts, suddenly there's enough space for our body to suppress that adrenaline and to suppress the cortisol and suppress that hyper overactive activity. And so there have been countless studies and reports done on people who do breathing exercises and measuring, whether it's with oxygen or heart rate, measuring their overall stress response. And people who do breathing exercises have a significantly lower stress response and tend to spend more time in that parasympathetic state, which so far, both tips I've given you are completely free, and better yet, something you can start to implement today. Another great tip that again is completely free is cultivating those healthy relationships, because when you can speak to somebody that you feel safe and comfortable with, when you can speak to somebody like, I'm feeling really fried, or I'm having these thoughts and I'm constantly feeling on edge, they can help you talk through some of those like scary scenarios, right? And I always say that like having this community, and I appreciate all of you here, and let me know in the comment section down below if you're somebody who has dealt with cortisol dysfunction, or if you're somebody who's currently dealing with elevated levels of cortisol. But I always say having healthy relationships, and even if it's just us here in this community that you feel that connection with, I would love to be part of that journey with you. But cultivating these healthy relationships help us really get outside of those thoughts and really, again, create that separation. Then, of course, there are many useful tools and tactics when it comes to supplementation. As a nutritionist who has a degree in nutraceuticals and dietary supplement science, I would be remiss if I didn't mention this. And I'm going to just focus on one category for today's video, because this is where I've truly seen the most success, and that is with adaptogens. Some of my favorite adaptogens for cortisol care are ashwagandha, holy basil, tulsi, and Asian ginseng. I have seen unbelievable success, not only in my own life, but in my practice, as well as the girls in my group course, Moms Need to Be Healthy Too, and those of you in this community or inside the Living Well membership area. So many of you have seen tremendous success by adding in these adaptogens. With all of these adaptogens, the reason I am such a super fan is that they actually help modulate the cortisol levels inside of our body. And here's the thing, when I take Tulsi, or when I take rhodiola, a personal absolute fan favorite, when I take it, it's going to behave differently in my body than it is in yours. And so the way that it behaves in your body is going to modulate to exactly what you need. Adaptogens have been around for centuries, but they are truly state-of-the-art healing tools. And so I always and will forever talk about adaptogens because I think so often we're like, oh yeah, they kind of work. They go in and they kind of work their way around your body, but that is not the case. They are superheroes. And honestly, they are to me one of the easiest and best ways to help to bring our cortisol levels back down to a healthy and productive level. So I know if you're dealing with low immune function, metabolic inflexibility, a dysregulated nervous system, and potentially hormone dysfunction, it can seem really challenging to think about taking on cortisol. But I hope that you found today's video helpful and that you're able to take some of the tactics and tools and start applying them today. And if you like today's video, you can let me know by giving it a big thumbs up. And now the subscribe button is right over here on the screen. Give that a click. That way you don't miss a single video. And I hope to see you back here next Thursday.